Hi everyone, and welcome to this month's Open Source Satellite Talk. So my name is Vicky Anderson, and I'm a Senior System Engineer at KISSpace, and I'm working on the Open Source Satellite design. So for those of you who aren't familiar, the Open Source Satellite is a microsatellite platform that we're developing, and we'll be releasing it online, so open source for anybody to use. So this includes the schematics, printed circuit board designs, and the software, everything you would need to build your own platform. Now, here at the Open Source Satellite, we're really keen to connect and develop relationships with like-minded individuals and organizations to help grow kind of open source space. So I'm really pleased today to be able to welcome today's guest, Michelle Thompson, and have her share with us some exciting things that she's been involved in through her open source space work. Okay, so welcome, Michelle, and thank you so much for joining us today. I'm really looking forward to hearing about what you've been up to. But perhaps we could just start with, who you are and why space is such an important topic for you. What was that thing that sparked your interest?
Well, I think that space is attractive to a lot of engineers and enthusiasts, and I had a healthy appreciation for space and the achievements in space and the technology that comes from it. Growing up. But one of my first jobs, was fortunate enough to be able to work on a communication satellite project. And this was a big transition for me, coming from a part of the country in the United States that did not have any space activity to speak of, Arkansas, and moving to California and working at Globalstar, at Qualcomm. And wow, was it a revelatory thing in many ways. And so I started to look at the differences in communications terrestrially versus the communications in space, and realized that there was significant differences, but a lot of overlap. And that's really what kind of the interest in space. As soon as I kind of developed an appreciation for the amateur, especially amateur radio satellite achievements in space, and the longevity and the history, how long it had been a part of the sort of achievements in space since the very beginning, I started to get more and more involved, and tried to bring open source into that practice. So tried to bring more open source work into amateur radio satellite work, which was not an easy thing to do. And so that's kind of the sort of where I'm coming from, and how I came to be a space enthusiast and to do work, technical work and regulatory work for space.
That's really cool. And I always like to ask, would you go up into space given the opportunity, or are you kind of a admirer from far? No.
Not at all. I would not do it. Mainly because, well, okay, so I have a fear of heights, and
it's quite high.
Space would be quite high, and having paid attention to the things that astronauts have to do to train, there's a number of things that I would not be able to accomplish. It would be awesome to be able to go in order to do experiments, but like, if I could pick another body, that would be great. Or or do it remotely. But no, I would actually, my joy comes from supporting others that are able to achieve these things, and to give them the absolute best communications and technical resources possible. I'm definitely a ground pounder, and totally okay with that.
No, that's lovely. No, that's really, really interesting. And so it's just what I like to ask, because people tend to fall very much into one or two camps. And so yeah. So is this, how did you, I guess, come about the Open Research Institute, or like what was your pathway there?
It also came from mainly amateur radio and amateur radio satellite. So there's two different services in the United States, ITU services, regulated by the FCC. There's the amateur radio service, which we're all relatively familiar with for terrestrial communications, but there's an amateur radio satellite service. And in volunteering and working for the traditional sort of legacy organizations in the amateur radio satellite space, they were not friendly to open source and not interested in what we were doing, not interested in digital communications, not interested in including a broad bunch of people or doing things in public, not interested in showing failures at all, very sensitive to this for, I would say, good reasons. We can be empathetic, but we needed an organization. We needed some sort of formal structure for volunteers to work under, and the traditional legacy organizations were not providing that. We had enough people and enough momentum and enough cool project ideas and enough published work that it was it was like, well, one day we should have our own organization. And so with some significant contributions from people like Bruce Perrins and Ben Hilburn and myself and a couple of others, we went ahead and formed a company. It's a nonprofit. It's a public charity, so a 501c3, to do this work. So that's how it came about. Was there was enough people wanting to do open source in space in the United States for open source for amateur radio satellite, and we were not getting any traction with the legacy organizations, with the existing organizations, and so that we had to make it, and that's how it started. So we're just rounding out about our first 5 years. Wow. And it's grown quite a bit, and plenty of things have happened, but successful.
Yeah, because I think I heard you're about a community of about 2,000 people worldwide now.
Yeah, the broader community is about 2,000 people. Those are the people that kind of pay attention to our work regularly and read what we write and all. The technical community that actively contributes is 250 or 200 or so. And at any one time, about a dozen people will be actively contributing towards the open source work. So pretty typical footprint for an organization like this.
No, it's a really great introduction. Thank you very much, Michelle, for that. Now I'm going to open the floor to you to tell us a little bit more about the Open Research Institute, your views on open source space, and what the successes have been.
At ORI, I organized some important regulatory reform for the amateur radio satellite service. This work greatly improved the ability of people to contribute to open source communications satellites design. If you have any familiarity with the United States ITAR and EAR rules, then I have good news for you with respect to being able to do open source satellite work with much less risk than in the past. I represent Open Research Institute on the United States FCC Technological Advisory Council. I am a technical specialist and a technical advisor for ARRL. I am very active in IEEE, and my day job is in landline telephony and rural broadband internet access. Open Research Institute's projects are open source digital radio designs with space and terrestrial applications. This includes a microwave band transceiver that can multiplex different data types and can adapt to channel conditions, a remotely accessible FPGA development lab with RF test equipment, a low-latency physical layer link designed for drones and aerospace, advanced forward error correction solutions, technical advisory committee membership opportunities, kit designs for HF, utility projects, and much more. We have a DVB S2 and S2X encoder in VHDL, a high-fidelity voice and data communications protocol that uses the Opus codec called Opulent Voice, and we are currently reviewing the regulatory landscape for open-source synthetic aperture radar designs. We look for areas where our strengths in FPGA, software-defined radio, and digital signal processing designs can be applied. We are very motivated to provide personal and professional development opportunities to our volunteers. We meet people where they are, and we do our best to get them further down the technical or educational path that they want to go. We're willing and able to do difficult regulatory work that makes it easier for people to use open source work in space. You can find us on the web at openresearch.institute. See the Getting Started link. We publish to GitHub as Open Research Institute. So why open source in space? Well, there's a lot of reasons to be an advocate for open source in space. But the quickest way to see the value is to turn the question around and ask, why not use open source in space? The biggest practical reason is that there is a growing number of companies betting everything on the successful commercialization and commodification of space. And these companies want to keep their designs to themselves as much as possible. Losing out to the competition on Earth is bad enough, but the capital expenses for space are very large. Virtually everything is high risk. Failure is famously not an option, and almost everything is inaccessible and non-repairable after it's launched and deployed. Fear and aggressive risk management have long been unquestioned approaches to engineering for space. Given these attitudes, it would seem somewhat inhospitable for free and open software and open source hardware to succeed. However, this point of view, when directly confronted, reveals a reality compatible with the use of open source in space. We know from the rise of the internet how incredibly effective and productive the use of open standards and open source software has been. Roughly 98% of internet infrastructure is open source, with Linux being one of the heaviest lifters. The internet has generated enormous amounts of value, both economic and social, and has transformed people's lives in so many ways. Some of these ways deserve criticism and correction. Fundamental changes in technology and society do not come without cost or unintended consequences, but the balance of all of the effects from the internet over time has been overwhelmingly positive. Companies make more money with open standards and open source enabled internet than closed standards and closed networks. The most successful companies we have ever seen owe their existence to the internet and therefore open source software. By relying on open source designs for things that are not business defining, companies can spend more time on the things that make them special and attract customers, and less time reinventing the same wheels over and over again. This doesn't stop companies from attempting to wall off as many gardens as possible, but we can clearly see that the money was made with open standards and a reliance on a lot of open source software. Space, with such enormous potential and growth, can have this same beneficial pattern, but only if we continue to advocate for the use of open source designs, especially where open source provides a clear win. It's both and not either or. By using open standards and open source, companies can focus more efficiently on their custom innovations and their custom inventions, the things that give them a business differentiating advantage, instead of having to handle everything from top to bottom. There are some very bright spots in space, such as the continuing existence and success of the Consultative Committee for Space Data Systems, or as we usually refer to it, CCSDS. All of the CCSDS standards are free and openly available. There are barriers to using open source implementations in space. Open source can offer increased safety and very high quality, but only if enough people are involved to give enough peer review and accountability, and only if these people can give independent feedback, and only if we don't burn out developers of critical components by only taking and never giving back. This is a clear case of the technical part not really being the hardest part. The hardest part of the effective use of open source technology is the people part, not the design goals or the implementation details. Since we know the technical part is pretty darn hard, we have our work cut out for us to enable, establish, and maintain a healthy open source ecosystem for space. This is why organizations like Open Source Satellite are so important, and why Open Research Institute strongly supports Open Source Satellite's work. When we have relatively small number of people involved in making products, and those people may not have a tradition or a practice of open communication, comment, and critique, one can see where a secretive and risk-sensitive industry just may not have enough willing people to go around in order to sustain a healthy open source ecosystem. There's a tipping point with open source practice. This is something that money doesn't solve because community engagement can't be bought. Open source means making everything required to duplicate a design to be freely published. The process to produce open source designs can be closed or open, but the end result must be freely published. This can be a sticking point for those coming from a military industrial background with harsh penalties for revealing technical details to the wrong people. A shift in thinking can be quite a lot to ask. The shift in thinking isn't just from closed to open. Open source advocates need to understand why designs for space must be conservative, and they have to accept some pretty harsh limits in terms of size, weight, and power. This is a different way of thinking, as terrestrial designs often assume unlimited power, always on internet, you can be almost any size you want, and they assume that a human can press a button and reset everything when the memory leaks get too bad or something goes awry. Remote operations are hard, and there's nothing more remote than space. While there are cost and regulatory barriers to open source in space, the biggest barriers are cultural and demographic. Inclusion and open process can be messy, unpredictable, and uncomfortable. Open source teams can and do produce work that fails, has critical bugs, misses windows, misses deadlines, and occasionally misses the entire point. Yes, people can steal your open source design and can use it in their own closed source work. There's plenty of open source work that is badly written. A lack of understanding or appreciation for open source licensing can prevent designs from being adopted. These downsides are outweighed by the upsides, even and especially in space. There's a lot of embarrassingly badly written commercial software. If you're not truly focused on your core competency, you are not as efficient as you need to be for the modern space race. Smart companies integrate quality open source and open standards work into their supply chain. As a result, they scale up and out into space faster, and they will continue to have an advantage because dividing and conquering is better than trying to manage it all in-house. The philosophy at Open Research Institute is pragmatic. Things that really aren't business differentiating need to be liberated by the open source community. But who's to say what's what? Where do you draw that line? The line between what's fair game for open source does change over time, as highly secret, very clever technological proofs of concept evolve into proprietary products, and then they gain competitors, and then time goes by, and they might become obsolete, or transform into commodities, or become part of the infrastructure. So at some point, transitioning designs to the public, licensing them as open source, is more of an advantage than a disadvantage to a company. A successful closed source to open source transition takes competent people constantly communicating, along with not a small amount of boundary challenging. It takes consistent and persistent work to keep public domain options front and center. We have to be vigilant and not let space be so special or so tightly controlled by so few that the incredible success of open source is swept aside. It is tempting to view open source as having some sort of magic pixie dust. It is tempting to expect customers and companies to accept limited or lower performance from an open source solution simply because it's open source. Promotion of open source as a religion really only works among fellow adherents. Open source has to be prepared to meet or exceed requirements and specifications, and has to be verified and validated, like any other solution, in order to succeed in industry. Space is definitely an industry. Not all of the verification or validation, or the decisions based upon them, will be fair or well documented. How can we best ensure the success of open source in space? We must demonstrate and publish designs of value. It is incredibly difficult to argue with a working published design. Document everything. Provide receipts. Publish test results. Tackle the challenge of compliance with commercial standards, even when it's confusing, complicated, or obscured. Find channel models or learn how to make your own. Keep coming back to difficult concepts. A simple working demonstration deserves the highest priority. Get it up off the ground as soon and as simply as possible. There is no better motivation than seeing your design come to life. There is no better way to cut through the noise than to show something working. You've probably heard the saying, show, don't tell, when it comes to writing fiction. Open Research Institute strongly advises our volunteers to do both show and tell. But if you have to choose, prioritize showing. If you have to choose between pitching something and publishing it, choose publishing. If you have to choose between describing something and demonstrating something, put your energy into demonstrating it. No one has unlimited time or energy or money. Demonstrations do more to promote open source in space than almost anything else. Many of the use cases, requirements, and specifications for space are available to open source practitioners from national space agencies and groups like CCSDS. It's a golden age for open source on Earth. It's up to us to do what we can by demonstrating documented designs of value to bring the unique resiliency and strength of open source truly into space.
Thanks, Michelle. That was really interesting. And there were a lot of really insightful thoughts there. And I must admit, I'm always kind of staggered by the breadth and the impact that the ORI is having. You know, it's such an amazing group doing so many things, I think, to like help pave the way for others, which is, I say, really exciting for those who are, you know, benefiting from the things that you guys are doing. So listening to what you had to say there, it's sort of prompted a few questions. Hopefully you don't mind if I quiz you a little now on some of those. Cool. So just, I think there's a lot of emphasis from my perspective that kind of people spend a lot of time, let's say, re-engineering widgets and wheels and stuff that you know that maybe you know already existed, rather than perhaps looking at that kind of shift, I guess, for like more modern engineering, which is actually a lot more service driven, and there's a lot more kind of value perhaps from the downstream activities. Would you say that's kind of your perception as well, or would you have a slightly different view on sort of where engineering's been trending?
Oh, I would agree. Like software as a service is a really big part of the engineering economy. Lots of attention paid to that. Very broad ecosystem, service-based things. And so when you look at open source, there's a lot of open source projects that focus on a particular individual thing happening. So it might be like a decorative dashboard widget that gets the point across. And maybe the author wanted a little more whimsy or joy about it, you know, or to be more direct or blunt when, you know, sometimes the ecosystem abstracts out the unpleasant news and the open source person just really wants to report the facts.
Yeah.
Or there's a calculation that groups up items with respect to physical quantity. You know, because we see this a lot in open source, you know, an open source project that scrapes data that delivers an actual result, or a filtering function that captures something the author's really interested in that isn't already represented in the standard user interface for commercial work. So when we talk about services, really any one of these might actually be a winner. They might actually be relevant or useful and can be built upon and hardened for commercial space use. So, but not all of them. Some of them are not relevant. Some of them are very silly. Some of them are trivial. Some of them don't work, right? You know, or badly written or whatever. So it's really hard to predict what might be useful or beneficial from the open source community. Therefore, paying attention to open source is very important. Most open source projects are like this, and there's a few that attempt to kind of tackle the service-based ecosystem, and those are the few large projects. You know, they think of things as having sort of a gradient. You know, you have lots and lots and lots of little projects, a few medium-sized projects, and then a very few big, ambitious projects. The big ambitious projects in open source tend to be more service-based, more ecosystem, more complicated. They exist. But, you know, when you're coming from a commercial point of view, especially commercial space, you need to look at everything. Like there may be something out there that really works for you. So in order to avoid re-engineering the wheel, you have to look at like, shall we adopt this very large open source solution? And there are some that have been adopted for space from time to time. You know, you see this happening, but there's lots and lots and lots of little widgets all up and down the continuum that would be useful. So it's a hard job, but you really do have to look at, you know, if you want to reinvent the wheel, great. But if you don't, then there's all these options.
I guess that's really just an interesting point you raised there about, there's a lot of stuff out there. And I wonder perhaps some of the trick is actually being able to find the stuff, right? Because it would be terrible to think there's some really lovely things been done, but they're just not visible. People, although they've been done maybe in an open source way, if we don't get them into the right space, people can't actually see them to use them. Or I guess the perception that people will have to spend so long checking on that whether the stuff that there is good. Is it worth the time, or would you be better off just doing your own thing because then it? So I guess there's some interesting challenges there as well about kind of this open source approach.
Very. Findability is a challenge with open source work. And you can usually tell if it has a repository, if it's been maintained. So if it's 4 or 5 years, no one's touched it, that may work against you. Even if it shouldn't work against you, if it's a complete solution that is current and works, the stigma of code that hasn't been touched in 4 years, for instance. And then evaluating it is hard. If it's not documented very well, if there's no comments in the code, then it may be rejected out of hand. So there's a mismatch between what an open source person will think is finished and what a potential maybe commercial space use person will, or another open source project may approach, when they're approaching code. So yeah, everything you said, accurate.
Okay, it's interesting. I guess it's some of those things that as the domains develop is actually how we mitigate some of that. So it's going to be an interesting one to solve. And that kind of nicely brings me onto my next query about, engineering and which there's a lot, silos, right? Everybody has their bit and they do their bit. And sometimes wonder, as you sort of talked about, we're in a more connected world now than we were perhaps when engineering was founded, however many, depending on when you want to call the start of engineering. And do you think perhaps that sort of there's some aspects that haven't kept up, maybe kind of the approach and mindsets that actually kind of open some of the doors to these other ways of working?
Very much so. Open source tends to empty silos. That's what we tend to do. We think that we at ORI, we think that an open source effort needs to be selective about which silos you target. And there is an alternative view that open source needs to liberate everything, that everything needs to be open source. We're a little more pragmatic about this. We're like, we pick things that are not business differentiating functions for whoever says that they own this. So you look at their turf war landscape and you're like, okay, so these are the things that we think are the things that are the special sauce or the trade secret or the business differentiating function, and then we pick something else, something that has to do that feels like a chore that everyone has to use. So not something that's trivial or silly, but something that's actually useful, that is on that downhill slide of like, this is now a commodity, everybody has to do it, but everybody's already still siloing it. Those are the things that are really like juicy targets. So pick things that people will come around to being okay with outsourcing to the open source community, and that we can actually provide a real service. And those things they often actually in the past have ended up being infrastructure and like a respected and appreciated part of the landscape. And this is a rising tide that lifts all boats. So that's kind of our mindset, is that we don't pick everything, and try not to pick fights about things that are so there is, like I said, there is a different way of viewing this, that you should pick fights with those things and you should make progress there. And other organizations are doing that, and all of us benefit from that work too.
Yes, yeah, I guess it's a collective effort to that change, and to say these are wonderful. You're segueing nicely into all of my next questions. Is perfect, but I think touching on that kind of real social aspect about that transition to open source, because actually, like you said, it's less about the technical. We can solve the technical challenges, but you can make this best thing since sliced bread, but if no one is willing to engage with you on it, then it's kind of a moot point, right? So I think that's that change, I guess, in mindset, and openness. If you pardon this sort of pun, to being open to open source and really embrace that way of working. And I think when you were talking earlier, you talked about kind of showing rather than telling, and that really sort of resonated with me. And I guess I guess demonstrations are one of the key ways to maybe sort of changing hearts and minds, because I can appreciate from some spheres the open source and some of the things have got a bit of an amateur or hobbyist kind of label, and so I guess it's changing those perceptions on that is a challenge.
Very much so. You know, the technical part's never the hardest part. It's always going to be the non-technical, social, cultural things that are the hardest part. And these challenges in getting past this sort of amateur hobbyist stigma or label is definitely difficult, especially for anyone that happens to be underrepresented in space engineering and technology already. So if you're not, you know, the typical professional space engineer, rocket scientist, then, well, you know, it falls off very quickly. If you think of it in terms of filtering, the Q function is very narrow there. You know, if you demonstrate and publish your work, it is much harder. If it's good quality work, can be, you know, meets the specifications and requirements as you understand them, it's much harder to suppress or censor or steal this work. There are significant stigmas in getting past this amateur and hobbyist vibe. And in some aspects, that stigma is well earned. Like knowing why there's a negative association is kind of key. And you can't really address these issues if you don't know what the problems or objections really are. And you can't take it personally. So what we recommend is at ORI is that you take a citizen science approach instead of a hobbyist approach. So the citizen scientist is someone that thinks about the science and is okay with criticism and okay with feedback. And, you know, and a hobbyist generally is thinking about themselves. There's nothing wrong with that. But a hobbyist is thinking about themselves, and everybody knows that. You're not reliable. A citizen scientist is committed to the science, a hobbyist is committed to themselves, and if you adopt a citizen science approach, you'll have less hobbyist baggage, especially dealing with commercial endeavors or high-risk endeavors. And it makes a difference how your work's treated. And it means that it does mean that your work is going to incur some honest feedback and review. And this can be painful to hear.
Yeah.
And it can be, so you have to kind of get used to that. So it's no longer this personal itch you scratched and published on GitHub or whatever you found the most fun to work on. It means that you have to kind of fit into that ecosystem that we're talking about. And, you know, that's pretty much it. That's the mindset. So once you kind of like approach it a little bit different, then the comment and critique being welcome and appreciated becomes not just a sentence, but it actually becomes like how you feel. And you'll be able to make a lot more progress and to fit in to the broader scientific community.
And I guess that's interesting as well, reflecting back on what you said earlier about, you know, there's perhaps certain avenues of work that are easier to, what's the word I'm looking for, kind of go after in terms of, it doesn't put you in direct conflict perhaps with some of the commercial entities and the like.
Yeah, you need to pick their battles, right?
Yeah. But I guess that's then interesting because then people might go, oh, but I want to do that really cool, exciting thing, which you're like, yeah, but that's unfortunately right now is not on, you know, or is not on that path that we're, you know. So I guess that's interesting what you're saying about that kind of almost greater good, you know, going, okay, yes, there's some really cool, shiny, whizzy bits, but there's also these other bits which will open up pathways to letting us do more of those if we can lay that foundation. So it's not ever, but maybe not right now, and having people who can see that bigger picture piece to go along with that.
Exactly right.
Yeah. Okay. And so obviously it's really lovely always to be able to share successes and say what's gone well, but you know, a lot of, sadly, what we learn sometimes, right, comes from things that don't go quite so well. And I know it's very awkward, and I do a bit of model based system engineering as part of my job spec, and it's very easy sometimes for those things to not go very well, and people then go, see, I told you it wasn't very good, we should never do it. And when it works well, people just go, well, yeah, of course, you know, and so, you know, and so sometimes the negatives or the things that don't work well kind of have more weight than the things that have worked well. But there's a challenge, I think, because you know, you don't want people to continue to make the same mistake forever, right? Because it's just burning energy, and sometimes you have to make some mistakes to learn, but you don't want people making those real, like, oh, you should never, you know, start here, and look, I can show you why, and you can put that energy to better use. So I guess there's an interesting perhaps tension in the open source world of being able to show things that haven't worked very well, but being able to demonstrate maybe the lessons from that, so they don't become a negative and kind of add weight to people who go like, see, it's all a waste of time, we shouldn't be doing it. I guess it's a bit of a tricky sort of balance. there, but a lot of
Yeah,
value maybe.
very much so. This is a very similar, some would say the same challenge that we have in science. So when you are a scientist and you want to publish your results, and you publish or perish in your career, usually as an academician, depends on how many successful things you did, then no way are you going to submit a paper where you talk about how your choice of adrenaline analogs in your bacteriophage experiment, it resulted in the death of everything and it all wrecked. And you're like, no, why? You just shove it under, you put it in a drawer and then move on to the next thing and burn up more grant money, right? But other teams will make, if it seemed like a good idea at the time, other teams make the same decision. So publishing negative results in science is personally punishing to the team or to the individual, but beneficial, huge overall. And in open source, we have the same problem. This is an open source product. Like the end result, we all agree that open source means that the design's published in a way that you can duplicate the design, that the end result is published, the source code, the schematic, whatever. But there's also whether the process was open. And can the process be closed and you still have an open source product? Absolutely. And that's the way most teams work. But an open source product and an open source process together gives the most value to the community. So it's a question of like balancing those two things, the product versus the process. If you hide the process but publish the end result of the work, then you only are going to show successes.
Yes.
So if you adopt an open process and an open source mindset, you show all your work along the way. It's very hard to do, but it gives superior results to the community. So other people see your decision making and your journey, and you get used to explaining your failures because you'll have a lot of them, but you're showing your undies, right? You're kind of like, oops, we screwed up, or we made this decision that seemed good. Other people then can avoid the honest mistakes you made. Or even the dishonest mistakes that you made, because we all make. And everyone will benefit when you do this. The trouble is that we all know that altruism isn't always rewarded, even in open source. And this consistent dedication to an open process method where you document failures over time, even though it's incredibly valuable, does require a thick skin, a change in mindset, courage to do. If you believe in long-term success and thinking of open source, you'll do it. But document your failures honestly and fully. Worst case, like make them all in private, but document the process when you publish your successful open source thing. And that's a good compromise.
No, that's a really interesting point, and definitely something people would be looking to sort of take on board. So we heard a lot about what the ORI are doing at the moment and those bits and pieces. I would love to do you have like that, I guess maybe near-term, long-term view of where the ORI might be going and where you'd like to sort of see things end up?
Oh, that's a really good question. In terms of like business model or plan, Open Research Institute is a research and development firm, and we take on and help projects that have fairly simple short-term goals, and we also take on projects that have kind of long-term messy goals, and we do technical work of both types, and then we also do regulatory work of both types. So the regulatory work almost always falls in the latter category where it's kind of long-term and messy, and there's no easy wins in regulatory or legal work. Just
us will be doing it right.
Right. But like, so unlike a commercial firm that may have a life cycle of lots of R&D upfront and then develop a product, productize, and then harvest as many profits as possible, we expect to be in this mode of helping projects achieve their goals, long or short term, and then just keep finding new projects that fit our vision. Our vision is like, yes, we want to do good open source work, but we really, really want to contribute to the professional development and personal development of people that want to learn more about this. What we found is that especially when it comes to FPGA, ASIC, digital communications design, is that you have people that know digital communications, that understand the waveforms, and you have people that understand digital circuits, and the overlap is pretty small. And with digital communications becoming so incredibly dominant and the demand being so high, the traditional pathways to be part of the workforce are insufficient for providing enough people to do this. So we provide a non-traditional path to gaining real world, actual published results. It's different than a school, and the vast majority of people that show up to do engineering volunteering with us do have some sort of formal training, but a lot of them are coming from one side or the other, either software or hardware, and just they really are on fire to do this. They're inspired to do this, and they realize that yes, you can do this. You can step up your skills through an open source project. So it's a practical sort of vocational approach to engineering rather than a formal book learning university approach. It's compatible, but that's kind of, and that has been something that at least for all of our board and all of our leads and a lot of our people that are working for us, that's like, this is cool. They are very happy about getting an opportunity to do this, to kind of make it accessible and to allow them to do these things. A lot of the FPGA development boards, a lot of the stations, and a lot of these tools are simply not affordable by an individual. We're talking like $4,000 or $5,000 for software, $4,000 or $5,000 for the entire lab setup. Many thousands of dollars for the RF equipment to go up into microwave, because microwave bands are what we do. And we try very hard to provide, here it is, here's a lab that you can log into anytime you want. So it's a remote, essentially, workbench. And we're trying very hard to stand up multiple ones of these and to kind of differentiate them to handle different aspects. And this has been a surprise to us, because we thought, when 5 years ago, that our focus would be publishing the work and that the work would be the focus, but it's actually the journey, the volunteer journey to participate and to contribute and to grow. And that's really the mission. So it's about the people rather than the product. Although, hey, products have not been that bad. We're doing a good job, in contributing, but producing happy people. We've gotten people into much better jobs, gotten them into the industry at all, gotten them into PhD programs, written letters of recommendation, and just generally kind of made it more possible for people to participate in a rapidly growing part of the economy. And that's been a surprise to us in a way, but looking back, it's like, oh, okay, yeah, it's always been about the people. We've always kind of viewed this as the technical part's never been the most hardest part of it. So, so we look forward to, as long as we can, providing this sort of opportunities to people and contributing wherever we can, and supporting other organizations that are doing the same sort of amazing humanitarian work.
No, that's lovely. I think that's such a, love the work that you're doing there in terms of making engineering more accessible, and a really interesting approach to kind of put. I think when you're in the industry, you take it for granted that there's a lab you can go to, you can fire things up, have a go, and you forget perhaps that that isn't something that's in everybody's ecosystem, right? They can't go and do those things, and there's always that challenge, isn't there? When people go for jobs and they're like, well, have you got experience? Well, no, but I need a thing to get the experience, and you get stuck in this kind of never-ending loop of, how do I get off this hamster wheel if you don't get the opportunity to try things out? So I think having that tangible, real experience makes such a difference, especially as engineering always seems to be chronically under resourced, and having people who know how to solve problems in a practical way is such a beneficial thing. So I think it's fantastic. And I guess as we get that bigger pool, right, the rest of the technical kind of almost takes care of itself, right? Because if you have the pool of the interested, motivated, knowledgeable people who want to solve problems, then the problems will get solved, won't they? It's having that pool to pick from is the trick. So yeah,
very much so.
Lovely. Well, thank you so much, Michelle. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you today. Always interested to hear about what the IRI is up to, and I'm sure we'll be catching up again soon in the future to hear what other things you guys have been doing. And we'll make all the links available along with this podcast. So if you want to get in contact with IRI or Michelle and her team, you'll be able to do that. And just thank you so much, Michelle, and look forward to hoping to speak to you again soon.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. It's been an absolute joy to be here.